religion and cultural diplomacy. Why am I interested in this topic, and why is this topic possibly important? If one understands that one possible task of cultural diplomacy is not simply to take your own culture and throw the wares at some other culture and say how great we are, but it also is an effort to understand another culture, mutual understanding between two cultures. The question then arises, how does one understand the other culture? How do we finally understand what makes it tick? Now, we use the word religion, but it's an extraordinarily ambiguous term. How do I really today, as an American, understand what makes the United States of America tick? What are its ultimate values? To just give you one example of how difficult that kind of a quest can be. About a year or so ago, I spoke with 4 people, 2 of them were friends, 2 were not. I knew them, they were acquaintances. Prominent Americans, 2 women, 2 men. The last one was Guido Goldman, who was he's now Emeritus Director of the Center for European Affairs at Harvard University. And I, at different points in different places, asked these people, I said, if I had to, or if you had to describe what the most important value of the United States is, what would you say? And when Professor Goldman gave me the identical answer to the others, I thought I was really onto something. He said, what makes America tick is greed. Now, if we did cultural diplomacy, how would we ever find out that at least for some Americans, it's not X, Y, or Z, but it is greed that dominates the culture? How would I find out if I'm dealing with another culture, what are some of the ingredients of that culture that make it work? Now the problem is, once we get into the whole area of religion, we get into a real can of worms. Because some people will say, I'm not religious. No, you people who are religious, you do your thing. So what do we then mean by religion? Are some people religious? Are some people not? Many years ago, when I was a graduate student in Harvard, one of my teachers was Professor Paul Tillich, Tillich, one of the great philosophers, theologians of the 20th century, who along with Bonhoeffer has an interesting history, and also Reinhold Niebuhr. They all had some roots to the Nazi period here. There was a Jewish background, they were all kicked out, and they went to the United States. Tillich came out of that kind of a background. And Tillich always argued, it's a lot of nonsense if he's at a cocktail party and somebody says, well, what do you do, Professor Tillich? And he said, well, I'm a theologian. And the other person would respond, well, I'm not religious. His response was, that is just a lot of nonsense. It all depends how you define the word religion. And Tillich would argue that religion is what is your ultimate concern. To be religious is to be ultimately concerned about something. And to deny that is to deny your humanity. And so Tillich, and now of course a lot of people in cultural diplomacy are saying you cannot dialogue with a culture if some people say, well, I don't believe in anything, and some people believe I'm in this. But I think this category of being ultimately concerned about something is one way in which we can begin analyzing this whole area. That's just kind of a brief introduction to say that we are entering here a can of worms in which all of the terms, 6 or 7 that I'll throw out at you very briefly, are horribly ambiguous terms. They're misused across the world, and we have to get some sense not only of definition, but of depth, but also depth and meaning to the terms. Now, before I go into the first category of secularization, what does it mean to be secular? I want to mention that a person who I think has done extraordinary work in this area is actually a Spanish scholar, Jose Casanova, who came to the United States about 2007 and is now professor of sociology at Georgetown University at the Berkeley Center there. And Casanova, whom I've gotten to know personally, I think is one of those sociologists who is not only concerned about precision, but he is a man of amazing knowledge. Because one of the things I have learned as I've gotten to more and more of Casanova's writings is you cannot deal with any of these global issues unless you have some sense of history. One cannot simply become a psychologist or a sociologist and dabble. One really has to see how these terms are anchored and how these terms are really being transformed as they are used. Now for Casanova, whom I will refer to simply to save time quite a bit in my few brief comments, a very important category is the term secular. He says, just like religion, the term secular is misused all over the place. No one really knows what you mean when you say, I am a secularist or I believe in secularity. And so what he does is really in three quick ways tell us that there are three different ways in which you can use the term secular. By the way, the term secular, I can't go into the history of that now, is a Christian term. It comes from saeculum. It comes from that period in the 4th and 5th century when you had priests who were in monasteries and priests who were in the secular world, in the outside world. But it was still a Christian world. And suddenly for secular among some people to be used as an anti-Christian term simply is a whole distortion of the history, but that's another whole matter. First of all, Casanova says there is mere secularity. What does he mean by that? The experience of living in a secular world and in a secular age where religious may be a normal, viable option. In other words, you can live in a world where there's a secular government. To be merely secular allows that to happen, but you can still be religious without people hounding you. And one of the examples that Casanova keeps referring to is the United States. And he says, in the United States Constitution, you have the use of this term secular as what he calls a statecraft principle. It's the neutral territory which at the one hand can say, there shall be in these United States freedom of religion, and on the other hand also says, there shall be no establishment of any given religion. He says there the government plays a secular neutral role to ensure that there will be freedom of religion, and also to ensure that there will be no establishment of any one religion as the religion of the land. So what he is then saying, that is mere secularity. Then he moves into two definitions that are considerably more negative. The second one he calls self-sufficient or exclusive secularity. That is the experience of living without religion. Your whole culture is dominated as if you are living without religion as a normal, quasi-natural, taken for granted condition. The third definition, which gets a little bit more harsh on the scale, is what he refers to as secularist secularity, the experience of not only being free of, but also of actually having been liberated from religion as a condition for human autonomy and human flourishing. Now at this point, that definition, in other words, you have been liberated. One way secular is used is, I have been liberated from all that crap that's called religion. It's irrational, it's nonsense, it creates problems in the world. He says, it's a freedom from being freed also from human flourishing. Let me get into this a little bit more. He, at this point, is very heavily influenced by a Canadian philosopher, Charles Taylor. If any of you are really interested in this field, that's a book that's got to be read. The only problem, it's over 600 pages long. But if you go on the website, look up Charles Taylor, you will notice how this book has been widely read by people in all fields. And what Taylor describes is the current global situation as living in what he calls an imminent frame. An imminent frame in which the human being in many cultures has excluded the transcendent. So your whole life is lived as if there is no God, as if there is no transcendent. Now, once you get to that harsh third type, according to Casanova, he will argue that there are really two types of secularist ideologies. The first, where religion is grounded in some progressive philosophy of history that relegates religion to a superseded stage. And what he is then trying to say is, when we think of globalism and the global trajectory, what is it? Is secularism on the rise, or is it not? And he says a lot of people take Europe. They take Europe as the example of secularism really winning the day. And religion is relegated to a past superseded age. He says the only problem with that, what's happening in Europe, is not happening, for example, in the United States. It's about happening in a number of other cultures in the world. How do you explain that? So that's one type of secularist ideology, this philosophical type. The second type he calls a political theory. And I quote directly from him: political secularism would like to contain religion within its own differentiated religious sphere, free from religion. He says the problem is that secularism is really operating like a religion, and it just doesn't like the other type of religion. But it calls itself secular to blast the other one as intolerant and as one as creating conflict. And he said there's something wrong here in our definitional world. For Casanova, it's perfectly right to hold position A and position B and position C, but don't say one is secular, neutral, free, when it's filled with ideological stuff like intolerance, religion creates conflict, and does not want to deal in conversation with what it calls religious. He said that is part of the split, part of the trouble we have in our culture, the opposition, where so many people react from emotions and will not rationally be in conversation about the deep values of the ideologies of the positions that are being held. Now, Casanova gets quite upset when religion, be it in Egypt or in Libya or in Europe, is called intolerant and one that creates conflict. He says, take a look at the 20th century. Who created the communist terror through revolution and all the hell and the death that that brought about? Who created the Holocaust? And his response is nothing other than secularist ideologies. Once again, I quote from Casanova: one may suspect that the function of such a selective historical memory is to safeguard the perception of the progressive achievements of Western secular modernity and politics as the condition for modern liberal democratic politics, for global peace, for the protection of individualized, privatized religious freedom. So he says a certain kind of religion is misusing the facts to support its own agenda. And notice, because we're going to get into this, he argues that what is happening in the global world, or what Taylor calls the imminent frame, we have increasingly, under the name of global peace, the propagation of religious freedom that is individualized and privatized and very often does not take the cultural context of what other people consider to be religious freedom. Another term, I'm just really zipping off some major terms that have to be dealt with in this theme of religion and globalization, religion and cultural diplomacy. What is globalization? How often do we use that term globalization? And again, let me just read 2 sentences from Casanova. If you want to follow any of Casanova's writings, or even see him on video, or a number of these other people that I have or will mention, all you have to do is actually look up Casanova. Drop Casanova into a Google search, Casanova, and it will turn up the Berkeley Center at the Georgetown University. And they're remarkable, the way they have all the authors, their writings, and even videos that have been shown. There's actually a great video about a year and a half ago between Casanova and Taylor in a dialogue up at McGill. What is globalization? According to Casanova, if by globalization we mean, in its objective dimension, the process of increasing interconnectedness of all societies, peoples, and cultures of the world, and in its subjective dimension, the growing reflexive awareness of belonging to one single global imagined community that inhabits one global space and shares the same global time, then it should be obvious that religions, and particularly the so-called world religions, are today and always will be dynamically interrelated in the manifold ways of the processes of globalization. Now, there's a lot to digest, but the point I'm saying is we can't simply understand what we mean by globalization unless we have some sense of that meaning. And another thing that I like about some of the newer literature, so in addition to Casanova, you have Taylor. Another person very significant is the sociologist at the University of California, Mark Juergensmeyer. Sounds German, but he's very American, where he talks about the trajectory of globalism. That globalism is a trajectory that is moving forward. Where are we at this moment in that trajectory? What are the positive contributions? What are some of the conflicts that are being created? By the way, I normally don't dress up like this, but they wanted to take some video shots of me before, so let me get a little more comfortable here. But this whole business of the trajectory of globalization. Let me read to you here a quotation from a discussion in the periodical called Current Sociology. This is by Juergensmeyer and Casanova. Globalization represents also a great threat insofar as it implies the deterritorialization of all cultural systems. Let me stop there to help you understand what they mean there. They are arguing that at this moment in history, most of the major religions are being deterritorialized, and they are available to every inhabitant on the world. Look at the internet, and you can suddenly learn all about Buddhism. You can become a member of X church, but you can also be a Buddhist. All of these major religions, and of course, the whole business of migration, immigration, the whole flow, for example, of people in the Middle East to the United States has allowed, for example, Islam to flourish all over the place. We're beginning to see huge new groups of Indian religious practitioners in the United States. So what they're saying is that we live in a time where religions themselves are being deterritorialized. They are being lifted out of their geographic sphere, and they become an imagined global religion, which anybody can look at, practice, and follow. And he says, let's go down to Casanova, that this also presents a threat to many people who feel that their cultural system is being deterritorialized by the rooting out, the lifting up of religion and making it global and worldwide. He goes on, globalization threatens to dissolve the intrinsic link between sacred time, sacred place, and sacred people common to all world religions, and with it the seemingly essential bonds between histories, peoples, and territories which have defined all religions. In short, then, globalization is something that is moving at a certain pace. It brings positive results, but for many people, it is remarkably threatened. Like this would be another 10 days of lectures to get all of that out. So I'm just, again, throwing you out with categories that I think you need to be aware of. And the most important point that a number of these sociologists of religions are making is that the major religions are, for the first time in history, becoming deterritorialized, global, imagined communities. And that, I think, is a striking phenomena to reflect on. When one throws, just one other sentence on this, Charles Taylor into this dilemma of globalization, Taylor would add the following, that the violent conflicts between sacred, secular, imminent forms of individual life and freedom of expression are in radical conflict between transcendent theistic norms. Now, rather than simply saying we have here different understandings of the world and of human beings, these have become expressions of enormous polemic and hostility. But that is part, I think, of the global world that we're in. Let me give you one example that may be helpful. I did my undergraduate work at Columbia in New York. And one of the things they did then, they still do, is have a required course on contemporary civilization and also literature humanities, where they, in 2 years, go through the great thinkers of particularly the Western world. They've now expanded it somewhat to a more global situation. But the point is, you have a lot of thinkers there that one agrees with and disagrees with. But one of the things that was always taught at Columbia is we treat each thinker with a respect that is due to that intellectual mind. And so, for example, one day there were usually teams of 2 or 4 of us. I was selected to represent somebody I radically disagreed with. And the other person had to do the same. But we had to do that respectfully, and the conversation could not simply be, that's a lot of crap and nonsense, but why did you think that was not valid? What are the points that you think are weak? What do you think are the points that are strong? Also at Columbia, we had a philosophy department that regularly sponsored debates on the most neuralgic issues, the critical issues, the burning issues, the hot issues in a society, and gave 15 to 20 minutes on each side of the issue for presenters. And then one would have a time where the presenters would respectfully be in conversation with one another, and then the audience would be in respectful conversation with one another about the issues. All I can tell you is the modern academic world, which I participate in, that ain't the case. You either like somebody, you don't like somebody. Oh, somebody's coming to campus you don't like, you try to boot them off. And that has pervaded so much of globalism as well. Now, it's interesting what a lot of people, Taylor, Casanova, and Juergensmeyer, are very concerned about. And that is that not only religion, but the life of many people, especially in the Western form of the global trajectory, are living in a situation where the individual has become center stage. There is a privatization of religion and what they call an individualization of religion. Let me read to you what Juergensmeyer says. Modern secularization, this is again the negative use of the term, entails a certain profanation, to make profane, profanation of religions through its privatization and individualization, and a certain sacralization, making sacred of the secular sphere. In politics, you now have the sacred nation, sacred citizenship, sacred constitution, science with its temples of knowledge, economics with its commodity fetishism, and so forth. But this is a very important point if it's true. This is the kind of thing that has to be discussed. But the truly modern sacralization, he's talking here specifically about West and modernization, because one of the things, again, another subject for about an hour, for about a week, is so much of the Islamic reaction that one immediately calls terrorism is against a secular understanding of the world that is promulgated by Western culture. But here's what Juergensmeyer says, but the truly modern sacralization, which constitutes the emerging global civil religion, is, quote, the cult of the individual and the sacralization of humanity through the globalization of human rights. You immediately jump. Isn't human rights a great thing? A lot of critical thinkers are saying, not so fast. Where did that 1948 document of the United Nations come from? It came from somebody's ideology. I'll say a few more things about that. Has it been successful in its implication? No way. A lot of cultures see it as an imposition of legal script being dumped on them. And particularly those cultures that are being threatened that I spoke about before are very resistant to that Western-dominated concept of human rights. I'll have more on that in a minute. Juergensmeyer continues. Let me just read that so that the real problem he sees is the cult of the individual and the sacralization of humanity. So what becomes sacred today is humanity through the globalization of human rights. The triumph and global expansion of human rights doctrines seems to confirm at least part of these visions, is what Casanova responds. Let me just go on here a little bit on this theme. The ongoing sacralization of humanity, which is part and parcel of the process of globalization, Casanova says, is not enough. What's being left out? Perhaps nothing short of a new resacralization of nature and the earth will be sufficient if we are to change our order and to face responsibility for the impending ecological crisis. So they claim the sacralization of humanity, the whole individualization that finds place in Western globalism, is largely responsible for what is happening to the ecological crisis. The Gaia principle, they say, should teach us that there is no such thing as an inanimate nature, that the nature of creation dwells everywhere. Now in class, we spent a fair amount of time on the whole issue of human rights. And you have a whole group of people who are now extremely critical of the whole human rights 1948 document because they see it as a legal concept being imposed by the West. Now, if you wanted to read one article on this whole subject, I want to read to you just maybe 3 or 4 sentences. The Archbishop of Canterbury, who has just stepped down last year, Rowan Williams, as some of you know, was a very distinguished professor at Oxford and has now returned to that teaching post. He wrote, and you can find it, just Google the thing, Human Rights and Religious Faith, wrote a very significant long article critical of the human rights situation today as basically non-enforceable and feeble and weak. But let me just read to you a few sentences of why he thinks so. And I really will limit myself because we want to have some time for questions. Now, what did the Archbishop writes on page 1? But more recently, questions about human rights have begun to give anxiety to some religious communities who feel that alien cultural standards are somehow being imposed, particularly in regard to inherited views of marriage and the family. And so we face the worrying prospect of a gap opening up between a discourse of rights increasingly conceived as a universal legal code and the specific moral and religious institutions of actual diverse communities. Another sentence. In what follows, I want to suggest in some ways in which we might reconnect thinking about human rights and religious conviction. More specifically, Christian convictions about human dignity. In other words, what they're getting at is have human rights, this whole document, and all the talk about it, ever seriously considered what does it mean to be human? What does human dignity mean? What does human relatedness mean? Again, I'm not advocating or denying any of these. I'm just trying to point them out to you. Let me just pick out a few other choice sentences of his in this very long article. Yeah, one place where he does this very well, the language of human rights becomes manifestly confused and artificial when divorced from our thinking about belonging, recognition, dignity, and so on. It is vulnerable to being seen as a culture in itself, usually an alien culture pressing the imperatives of universal equality over all local custom and affinity and specific ways of making sense of our world. And he says something from the outside that simply can't be imposed. There need to be cultural conversations on these matters. What does this mean? How does this relate to our culture? And he says that hasn't happened. So he says you can talk about human rights till you're blue in the face, and it's not going to seriously happen because of some of the reasons here. But I also want to point out that Juergensmeyer and also Casanova, sociologists of religion, and others, there's a whole literature on this, are extremely critical of what they call the sacralization of humanity, and with that, the so-called human rights, which they claim have as much chance of being implemented as a number of other things we could think about. The final thing that I want to make, the point that I want to make is this. At the very end of one of his articles, and I think I have that right here, yes. Casanova says there are three competing understandings of the global order that are out there today. And this is a very new article of his, just appeared earlier this year. And I know I will confuse, but let me be brief because we can't go into detail about all of these. He says there are three competing conceptions of the emerging global order. And there's an abstract at the beginning of the article. I'll read a sentence from each of these three, try to make a comment, but you can pursue this again on your own because these articles are quite easy to find. All right, here's what he says. One, the first one he calls cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism builds upon developmental theories of modernization that envisage this transformation as a global expansion of Western secular modernity. So cosmopolitanism is a form of global expansion that has essentially one goal, and that is that Western secular modernity will grow and it will influence the whole world. That's one of the things our Islamic sisters and brothers resist enormously. They really have very low tolerance for what he calls cosmopolitanism. He says, Western modernity by cosmopolitanism is conceived as a universal process of human development. Casanova says, no. What we need to take seriously are multiple modern modernities. The world is not going to be one universal whole, as cosmopolitanism wishes, but we have to take seriously, yes, there's modernism, there's growth, and there's globalization, but we have to leave a lot of room for what he calls multiple modernities. One other sentence on this. Religions that resist privatization are viewed as a dangerous fundamentalism. So anything that resists this view of a universal modernism simply is tagged as fundamentalism that threatens the differentiated sources of secular modernity. And instead of that fundamentalism, of course, we know that Casanova argues we are at an age of global denominationalism in which there's a new formation of religion deterritorialized from its original geopolitical location. That's one position, cosmopolitanism, which Casanova has no use for at all, thinks it reads the whole world wrong. Secondly, is a book that you certainly have heard about, and that is Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. So his second position, after cosmopolitanism, is a clash of civilizations. Huntington's conception of the clash of civilizations maintains the analytical components of Western modernity, so far so good, but stripped of any universalist normative claim. What's dead wrong about the cosmopolitan position is that it claims a universalist normative claim by what it is talking about. He says, At least Huntington does not hold to that position. He goes on, modernity is a particular achievement of Western civilization that is grounded in the Judeo-Christian tradition. The world religions are the continuously vital core of what are essentially incompatible civilizations doomed to clash with one another for global hegemony. And basically he accuses Huntington of misreading the freeing up of the major religions from their territorial space. And so we no longer have this rigid clash of civilizations according to Casanova. And finally, and I'll come to an end, what he calls the model of multiple modernities. The model of multiple modernities is presented as an alternative analytical framework that combines some of the universalist claims of cosmopolitanism, devoid of its secularist assumptions, with a recognition of the continuous relevance of the world religions for the emerging global order. And then much of the rest of this article I like very much. I'm going to stop here, though, where he talks about the future global order. He says, before you can start practicing any kind of cultural diplomacy and trying to understand other cultures, how your culture relates to them, how some of these major themes that we're talking about function, you've got to give some thought to what is the current and the future global order. Where are these things heading? So let me just stop, take whatever questions there may be. Not that I'm able to answer them, because one of the things I want to say is that we, I think, in this global order have reached a point of terrible complexity, and we don't have enough thinkers who are really analyzing this stuff. I mean, I can really put on my hand about 5 or 6, 7 serious North American thinkers who not only know the sociological categories, but who have a sense of the history, who have a sense of the religious past and present. And I don't mean just the last few hundred years, but they divide things up into the pre-axial, the axial age, the current age, and so forth, where they actually analyze this stuff with enormous competence. The same thing with the term secular is not a new term. They go into the historical roots and what that means. And so one thing you should be left with is that we're in a stage of real confusion. And one wants to be very careful as one talks to other people in terms of cultural diplomacy, that one does not come across with, I know it better than you. I certainly don't. If anything, this stuff has led me into a whole new area of confusion. But I think that's what intellectual challenge is all about, to bring you into areas where you're really forced to think. That's what I think we need to do. And so if I leave you in the midst of complexity and some confusion, that's fine, because I think that's where we're at, and that's one of the things we've got to take very seriously. One of the things I'm so happy about the various programs, the academic programs of ICD, is that one of the few places that are really trying to clarify some of these issues. So I've thrown out to you a whole bunch of terms that are related to cultural diplomacy and religion that need some clear understanding and definition before they're used. And when I was moving through the cycle, I was not trying to take one side or the other, but simply trying to suggest to you where some of the discussion is. But let me stop there.